Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you can sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you to hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. Lots to talk about this week. I've been keeping busy, watching some of the political conversations, watching the federal debate. And again, we're never going to get too political in this channel, but I want to talk about sort of the macro, the bigger picture, because one of the things that I've noticed is that in every single poll online, every single poll has said, asking voters what is the most important, topic, or what is the most important thing in this election. And it's been a unanimous decision that across all these polls has been the cost of living. That's basically what is driving, or the most important topic for Canadians. And I found it very interesting that, the cost of living at this most recent federal debate on TV, it was discussed for about 5 minutes out of an hour and a half program. Which I really, again, think highlights to, how out of touch not only the media is, but I think, the politics as well. But, because I think it's important, because what this whole channel really is about is just, financial education, helping people understand, markets, money, and how to ultimately protect your hard-earned capital in whatever way you decide to do that. Because everybody here that's watching this channel, works hard for a living, and you need to preserve or store that value of hard work into assets. And so we try to help explain the system here. And so, when I see polls that come out and say, hey, listen, every Canadian is concerned about the cost of living, it really is, I view it as an opportunity and a time to shine. And so I had a conversation this week. A reporter, from the Financial Post calls me up and says, hey, I want to ask about what's happening in the housing market, the federal election, the policies. And he goes, are any of these promises or any of these political platforms actually going to change the housing situation? And so what I kind of said to him, I says, well, if you watched the federal election last night, I said, there was one thing that I think was kind of summarized everything. And it was actually a piece from, Love 'em or Hate 'em, it was from Jagmeet Singh. And so I want to clip to his little piece here on housing. So clip that in right here.
You're promising to tackle skyrocketing housing prices. One of the ways is with that 20% tax on the sale of homes to foreign buyers. 2/3 of Canadian families actually own a home already. If you're successful at cooling the housing market, that would mean that people who have invested their life savings in their homes may not have it anymore. They're relying on that for their retirement. So what is more important to you? Helping younger people get access to the market, or allowing older Canadians who rely on the value of their homes to live?
It's a really fair question. And when I spoke to people, I go door to door in my riding of Burnaby, people who've got beautiful homes. I ask them, what's the number one concern? They say housing. And I kind of look around at their house and say, well, you've got a home. They say, well, I'm not worried for myself. I've got a place, but I'm worried about my kids. And they're more concerned that their kids will never be able to find a home than their own circumstances, because they're okay. They are worried about their kids, and the reality is it is impossible for young people to even imagine buying a home, let alone renting a place that's in their budget. So we've got to get the big money out of housing. Young people, young families, professionals shouldn't have to compete.
So your answer is that it is more important for young people to get into the housing market rather than protect people who have equity in their home.
We can do both, and our plan is that everyone's telling us the number one concern they have for their kids is that they're not sure they're ever going to be able to own a home. We want to change that. It's gotten worse with Mr. Trudeau. We're going to fix it.
So the message I wanted to take away from that rambling for about a minute and a half was that he said he cared equally about preserving the existing home equity and helping first, young home buyers, and that they would do both, that they could help preserve the existing equity and then help young buyers. And the reality is you cannot do both. It is really one or the other. You can't have affordable housing, but yet also maintain the existing equity in homes. But again, no politician is going to come out and say, hey, listen, we're intentionally going to pop this housing bubble. We're intentionally going to deflate asset prices by 15, 20, 30%. And then we'll have more affordable housing. Because the reality is, it's like if you've got a high cost of land because you've got this, 30-year bull market that's been perpetually supported, the cost of land is the largest cost of housing. And so that's a fixed price. So it sort of helped me unwind this whole thing that I said, listen, you have this today. I was telling this reporter. It's always interesting because you can kind of hear when you're talking to them, kind of like the light bulb starts to slowly tick on. You almost sound like this conspiracy theorist, but I go, listen, you've got this social divide between the haves and the have-nots. So you've got basically a demographic that's pinned against one another. So you've got the boomers that have obviously inflated or have enjoyed the benefits of inflating house prices, inflating stock prices. And then you've got the younger cohort, which has basically been locked out of those assets. That unless they get help from, their parents who are in the housing market, you're pretty much at a significant disadvantage and you fall basically further behind. So this sort of social inequality, but you've got a situation where the boomer generation, which is the largest demographic, is going into the retirement years, and everybody's retirement plan is, my house went up $2 million, I'm selling that and extracting the equity. That's my lottery ticket. That's my retirement. So you've got this massive cohort. So every politician is aware of this, and is in this weird juggling act of like, hey, these guys over here are kind of screwed, and we can't really screw these people because they're going into their prime retirement years. And it's just fascinating to watch. And so he says, does anything change? Long story short, does anything change? I said, nothing is going to change in these policies because you're working around the edges, right? Like a little bit more housing, a little bit of a foreign buyer's tax, a little bit of help for the first-time home buyers through lower CMHC insurance premiums and government-assisted down payments. Like it's all working around the edges. Like what anything to get like meaningful affordability, you would have to have basically a reset. But as I went on to elaborate, is that nothing is going to change because nobody's going to change the existing system. It's larger than one politician. And so, for example, I said, all you have to think about is, adding housing here and doing a couple little tweaks on the demand side and changing a few regulations over here, when the elephant in the room is the existing financial system. The elephant in the room is, this week we had the ECB's Madame Lagarde come out and say that she's not tapering QE, that they're maintaining their program in the same week that European junk bonds, which is basically below investment grade debt that has a higher probability of default, it's considered risky debt. It's literally called junk bonds, going into a real negative interest rate, a real negative return on junk bonds in the Eurozone. But that's happening basically across the globe. So you're compressing savings instruments. Savings instruments are being destroyed, right? So if you go into your GIC, you go into your government bond, we go into the Eurozone, if you've got junk bond yielding zero, all this capital starts flowing out of it. It flows into where? Well, one of the assets everybody's well aware of is the housing market. I don't care if it's in the US, I don't care if it's in Europe, I don't care if it's in Canada, but capital is flowing into where it can get any semblance of a return. So he said, so long as you can go into the bank and get a variable rate mortgage today at 1.5%, with inflation currently running at 3%, you will continue to get a lot of capital flows into the housing market. People see it, they go 30-year bull market, real negative interest rates, I'm being incentivized to borrow money. I mean, the alternative is you could not put it in the housing market and you could put it into a GIC, which will get you, 0.25%. If you compound that over 100 years, you might make a couple $100. This is what's happening, and this is what's happening. You can see this capital is also flowing into the stock market. As you can see, record inflows into the stock market. These things are all correlated. Cryptocurrencies, you guys know here, I'm extremely bullish in that space. Why? Because it's an alternative investment class. Capital is flowing because it has nowhere else to flow. It's being punished. And so that was the whole thing, but it really compounds into this whole cost of living crisis that isn't going to get resolved because you're kind of at the end of this Keynesian economics, this debt-fueled financial system that is kind of on life support. So basically, if you look at one thing I'll highlight here is Canada's total non-financial debt to GDP is a massive 343%. It's one of the highest in the world. So total non-financial debt is 343% of GDP. What that basically means is that you have so much debt in relative terms to how much your economy is growing that any sort of slowdown in economic growth just pushes that number even higher, and it becomes that much more difficult to repay. And that's why you have interest rates at zero, because once you start raising interest rates, the debt burden becomes so heavy, and that there's so much of the private sector and the public sector that needs to allocate their capital and their resources to paying down this debt that it pulls away from additional spending elsewhere. So this is why rates are basically stuck at this weird zero bound. Now, again, you have several scenarios here where how do you alleviate a debt to GDP burden? How do you alleviate it? So you have think about this. You have too much debt, not enough economic growth. Lower growth, the debt burden goes higher. How do you balance these two out? Okay, well, I mean, history is replete with examples of debt crises and failed currencies, and so you really have several options. You can do number one, which is obtain very high real economic growth. So you have growth just go boom and just explode higher, but that's kind of hard to do in an environment where demographics are fading. You got already a lot of debt, so it's hard to kind of grow out of that. It's kind of because it kind of weighs down consumption. You can do austerity, government austerity, the private sector austerity, stop borrowing, but you're in a credit-based system, that's not very feasible. At the same time, if people stop borrowing, that's going to lower economic growth. Number three is you can do a debt default. You can simply just default on the debt. Call it a day. Wipe it out. Destroy the creditors and have some form of debt jubilee. We've seen governments obviously default before. Highly unlikely in this scenario. It will certainly not be the first choice. Number four, as we've talked about, it's a hyperdeflation or a financial repression, which is again a scenario where you let growth run hot without increasing the interest rates, and you try to get away with it, which is really, when you really think about it, I mean, brutally tell me, is that not what we're doing today? Governments spending a lot of money, record deficits around the world, central banks coming in and buying up the government debt, putting it on their balance sheet, saying, don't worry about the free market, the private market will buy the debt. Central banks buying the debt as the governments just spend as much as they can. Inflation running at 3%, 4%, 5%. It's transitory. It's transitory. Everybody keeps saying it's transitory. How long is it going to be transitory for? When do we determine that it's no longer transitory? Do we wait another 6 months? Do we wait a year? Do we wait a year and a half? Do they have to go in and change the CPI basket to remodel it, to say, hey, it's 2%? So this is my whole viewpoint, is I think that what we can clearly see is if we look at money supply growth, if you look at central bank balance sheets, like, you can't sit here and tell me that they're not at least trying to debase the currency. Again, we're going to see how successful they are. But you can't tell me they're not trying to debase the currency. There's one more thing. Canada is not alone. I want to highlight something here from Luke Groman. So Luke Groman, if you're not familiar, runs a great newsletter that I subscribe to, Forest from the Trees. One of the most respected people, I think, in the finance space. You'll hear him on all sorts of these podcasts. If we go back to financial history, so we look at the U.S., right? So the U.S.'s debt to GDP, the public debt to GDP, is about 130% of GDP. Now, the government, in order to service their interest payments, obviously has to have enough recurring tax revenues coming in to pay those, and obviously they're issuing debt to repay the existing debt. But anyways, you've got public debt at 130% of GDP. Now, based on his analysis and obviously history, is that you need to get U.S. public debt down to around 70 to 80% of GDP in order to basically have the ability to normalize interest rates. In order for the Federal Reserve to actually begin hiking interest rates without any pain, without any significant market sell-offs, the economy contracting, his view is that you need to get federal debt to GDP around 70 to 80%, and of course without the bankrupting the government. And so if we assume that the U.S. continues to grow, their debt burden continues to grow at 8.75% per annum, which it has since the first quarter of 2008. So if it continues to grow at its current pace at 8.75%, you will need, just in order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio down to 70, 80%, it needs to grow 18%. GDP needs to grow 18% per year for the first 2 years, and then it needs to grow 19%, 20%, 22%, 24% to get that ratio down to around 70 to 80% by 2026. So what that ultimately highlights is that basically, again, any sort of economic slowdown, forget Canada, you're talking about the entire world, where that debt burden becomes even more insurmountable. So this is the reality that we're in. No federal politician in this election is going to talk about it. It's much too complicated. It's much too nuanced, and it doesn't fit any sort of political narrative. You're never going to hear CBC News talking about this. But this is what we do on this channel, is that if you understand the game that we are in, if you understand the rules, how they are being played and changed, you put yourself in a much better position. So hope that helped. As always, we'll see you next week.